Did you ever dream of creating a group of followers that'll get stuff done for you while you're out bashing heads in a dungeon? Maybe work on bettering or potentially exploiting your base of operations while you're out adventuring? Well, the optional leadership subsystem might be just the thing for you. It kind of allows you and the GM in order to bring a certain sense of life and a sense of interaction with whatever world you're trying to interact with. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So, leadership is a long term subsystem. It's not something that you're going to be doing a single instance of, nor is it something that is only going to take a session or two. It is a very long term subsystem where the players can establish a new organization or group, possibly have its own base of operations. They can gather followers, get lieutenants, have other people lead while they're away adventuring, and they can gradually increase their influence in whatever environment they're in. It offers a really flexible way to depict the party's growing influence and impact on their base of operations and the world during downtime mode. And it might give you some benefits in the in-game world that you might get similar to joining a guild or a chamber of commerce, maybe an organized gang if that's your inclination, or whatever your imagination and your party's inclination might lead them to. The organization can be active during downtime, offer you some quest opportunities, or if your GM is game, play a significant role in the actual overall story of the campaign. So this optional leadership subsystem does kind of bring a depth to the world that you're in that you might not be able to get in other ways. Now, in my opinion, this might be the second easiest subsystem to implement, but there is a huge caveat here to mention. So first, it's long-term and does not require constant attention. This is something you're really only going to be doing basically during downtime. So there'll be sessions where you're not really doing anything aside from maybe getting reports from your leadership and lieutenants. It also allows the world to not seem so static when the player characters aren't present in the world, and it gives a lot of life to the setting. It actually makes it feel a little bit more real. Now, here is the huge caveat. If a GM decides to take on the leadership subsystem, they will have to put in quite a bit of work to implement this. It's not just a minor thing that they have to deal with. There is a lot to it, and they really need to be aware of what they're getting themselves into. There's a lot of tracking, there's a lot of additional quests, there's a lot of opportunities, there's troubles, and there's also certain windfalls and things that the GM is going to have to keep up with as play continues. With that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the organizations themselves. Now, any organization that you have is going to have its own organization levels. And this level is going to range from 1 to 20, kind of like a lot of things, a lot of levels that you have in the Pathfinder system. Now, in order to really be considered an organization, it has to be at least level 1. There is no such thing as a level 0 organization because a level 0 organization means that there are no followers. There's no one involved in it aside from the player characters themselves. And if there is no followers, then there kind of isn't a real organization. However, in the leadership subsystem, leveling up is not really about gathering some type of points like leadership points. Unlike a lot of other subsystems that is part of Pathfinder, instead, the organization levels up through its growth process. And you get these levels as a reward for completing quests, engaging in role-playing scenes, or succeeding in other subsystems like influence or reputation. The player characters can add non-player character followers to their organization through these types of events. Now, initially, they're only going to have a few level 0 NPCs to follow the player characters, but as the party gains more and more influence, they're also going to gain more and more followers, and they can also acquire higher level followers and a smaller number of much higher level followers called lieutenants. When the organization reaches certain thresholds of these followers, certain amount of thresholds of recruits, it levels up, increasing the maximum level of followers that it can have, as well as giving you a number of lieutenants. And it is these lieutenants that will kind of run the organization when you're not around. Now, the first thing I want to talk about here, I know the manual actually might talk about base of operations right here, but I'd rather go into operation NPCs because it makes a little bit more sense from my end to actually talk about the NPCs first. So you are going to have a certain number of followers and a certain number of lieutenants. One of the big things to remember about these particular NPCs are they are non-combatants, and they are determined by the level that your organization is at. So we'll go ahead and throw this chart up here, but just to kind of, I don't want to hit every single line. We could sit here and spend 10 minutes doing that, but let's go ahead and start with, at level 1, you're going to have 1 to 2 followers, and the maximum follower level is going to be 0. So these would be level 0 NPCs and only 1 to 2. You'd have no lieutenants and no lieutenant levels. However, you get to somewhere around 10, you could have 54 to 75 followers. You may also have a maximum follower level of 2. You will also be able to have 6 to 7 lieutenants, and these lieutenants would not be at level 2. They could be up to 3 to 4. And this is how we generally read this chart. So we'll kind of take it from one side to the other. You're going to have your first column, which is going to be the level that your organization is. Your second column is going to be followers, and this is going to give you the total number of followers that you could have for your level. The third column is going to be the maximum follower level. This would be the highest that your followers could be. And as you can see, the highest for this is going to be level 4. The next column over is going to be the lieutenant column. This will tell you how many lieutenants or leaders that you can have while you are away adventuring, bashing heads in a dungeon, or whatever you're going to be doing. And then the last column is going to tell you the lieutenant levels, and this would be the highest level that these NPCs may be. You can tell from this chart here that at 20th level, you may have 9th level lieutenants at their particular highest. So when an organization has followers and lieutenants of different levels, the majority of them are typically at the lowest possible level. And as a general guideline, an organization, including yours, is going to have twice as many NPCs at a particular level compared to the next higher level. So let's go ahead and take a level 10 organization. A level 10 organization can have 54 to 75. To make it easy on me, basically, let's go ahead and say that it has 60 followers. The maximum that could have is maximum follower level of 2. So by that logic that we just talked about, you would probably have, just to make it easy, we'll do 40 level 1 and 20 level 2. So you would have twice as many level 1 followers as you would at level 2. It basically gives you a quick estimate of the level distribution among the organization's members. But of course, the game master is the one who's going to have freedom to adjust the level of individual followers, basically as they desire, as well as how the story would flow with the certain number of levels. If you have overpowered lieutenants, then you're pretty much might be running a mafia at a certain point, which if that's the story you want to do, that's great and go ahead and do it. But in some cases, they might be too overpowered. Now, when the minimum level for the lieutenants increase, the lower level lieutenants either level up to meet the new minimum or they become followers of more powerful lieutenants that are newly recruited by the player characters. And that really depends on kind of where the story's going, what the narrative is, and kind of the settlement that you're in. It is unlikely if you have a very low level settlement that you are going to have super high level lieutenants coming in. Now, these followers and lieutenants that the player characters get to their organization basically show their loyalty to the player characters and the organization. And it is basically their job. They are dedicating themselves to maintaining this organization, its base of operations, and this organization and their own way of life. Because of these efforts that they do, the player characters are not required to cover basic upkeep costs for their base because the NPCs are the ones that are doing it for them. They are the ones who are basically doing the maintaining. They are the ones who are expanding and doing the upkeep costs as the organization grows in level. The followers and the lieutenants are the ones who are taking care of these responsibilities. Now, to kind of counterpoint this a little bit, you cannot have the lieutenants or the followers kind of interact with you in active adventures. They are not adventuring characters. They are basically background characters that are just, and we'll use the term organizational characters. They would not participate to go down in the dungeon with you or to go help kill a person, nor do they provide any free magical resources or labor. You couldn't say, well, I have a follower who's a crafter, so I'm going to have them build this for me. Or I have a lieutenant who's a magic user and I would like for them to produce X amount of scrolls for me. You might have that. They would still need to be paid for those things individually. They don't do magical resources or labor for free. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about cohorts and new player characters. This is kind of, out of the book here, but although followers and lieutenants who drive the organization's progress don't join the player characters on adventures, there are instances where the organization can introduce NPCs by serving as a compelling narrative device to introduce that NPC who is going to introduce and accompany the party to whatever their adventures are going to lead them to. If you had a campaign that you were running and let's say someone's brother or a friend was coming to visit and they also played tabletop role-playing games or played Pathfinder, you could have that person come in and be introduced through the organization in order to do this one-shot with the group. It's an excellent way to introduce player characters and NPCs for small efforts. There's a good example from the book here, and that is if the player characters are leading a mercenary army, a promising officer could become a new player character. So they don't necessarily even need to roll something up just to be there for one game. You could use an existing lieutenant and kind of bring them in as an active player character. These non-player character cohorts and these new player characters should be treated as any other additional character in the party. They should have their own backgrounds, they should have their own items, they should have their own spells, activities, things that they do, and this backstory should connect them to the player characters in some way. Once again, your organization is there to enrich the storyline, so the player characters or the non-player characters you introduce should enrich the overall story. Let's now talk a little bit about a base of operations. So a base of operations is basically the building or the structure or the keep or the camp where your particular organization is going to operate out of. And basically, once you get past a certain level, it's all going to be up to the situation. It's all going to be up to the setting. It's all going to be up to the adventure. And it's going to be up to the game master. However, generally speaking, the first 2 or 3 levels, you probably won't need a base. Usually when you start getting lieutenants is when you might start needing a base. That is just kind of coming from me. Don here is saying that. I don't see anything specific in the book as to when you need to establish one, but that is where in my head, around level 3 is when you would start working on a base of operations. But after a certain point, it becomes necessary for the player characters to establish this base, and it serves as a home for the organization. It's something that the organization centers around, and it's where the upkeep and the growth happens. It provides a space for the organization to operate and to expand according to whatever purposes that the player characters intend for this organization to do. There's a good example from the book, and that is if they are in charge of a mercenary army, then they may require a keep because they need to train those mercenaries, they need to train the NPCs, they need a stronghold in order to defend the surrounding area. So depending on what the organization does will determine what type of base of operations they need. Now, organizations do typically acquire a base of operations early on. It is essential for them to have one by 6th level at the very least, and this is kind of the only thing that I've actually read about it. Now, by 6th level, you should have one. Maybe you don't. It depends on the organization's story, but in general, you would need to have a base of operations of some sort. One of the things to note, though, and it's kind of in the book here as well, is that the base of operations doesn't have to be stationary. It does not have to be a fixed building. A mobile setup, such as a caravan, a circus, a flagship, if you're doing a boat, if it's a pirate adventure or anything along those sorts that can be moving, is fine for a base of operations if that organization is constantly on the move. The good example they had, and I've already mentioned it here, circuses or a merchant caravan, you could have a base of operations be the circus itself or the caravan itself. And that's actually a pretty fantastic way to kind of move around and get stuff done within an area. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about is running leadership. So, when you're utilizing the leadership subsystem in your game, it is important to consistently reward the player characters with new player characters who join their cause throughout the campaign. There is nothing more disheartening than to be running this organization for many, many sessions and you come back and the player characters would ask, well, what happened with the organization while we were down on level 4? And you don't really have an answer for them. It kind of doesn't give them any incentive to continue to drive the narrative of the organization. So this feedback would serve as a form of incentive in order to keep the narrative going. You can maintain a typical rate of growth, provide the player characters with enough followers for the organization to level up at a similar pace as the player characters themselves. For example, let's say they went down into the dungeons at level 3 and they came back up as level 4. Well, while they were down there, they go back to town and their organization has grown to level 4. It now has a few more followers and maybe they got their first lieutenant here. Maybe they didn't get at level 3, they got at level 4. Showing this growth as they level up with the organization leveling up at the same pace is a good incentive in order to keep this organization going. Now, that isn't to say that it needs to match the player character's level exactly. There's going to be instances where some varying of the rates of rise might be warranted. There is some examples from the book where, let's say you have a 10th level player character, they might have a 20th level organization with capable lieutenants who are level 9 because it's a 20th level organization. So there's a lot of variance between a level 10 player and a level 20 organization. However, the lieutenants would be similar. You'd need to have a compelling reason to put such a powerful organization into the player character's hands. But this is your story. It's the GM story, it's the player character story, and the GM and the players are all players at the table. So it is that story that you're trying to tell, and this can breathe so much depth into it. Now, alternatively, the player characters could start accumulating followers maybe later in their adventuring career. They started the organization at level 15. And so at level 15, they have a level 1 organization. So you might accelerate the growth of that particular organization, or maybe you could leave it lower. There's nothing wrong with potentially doing that and have it go at a more organic rate. So there are certain things, and the book calls them leadership events, that basically indicate that during periods of downtime or extended stretches where the player characters are not actively engaged, but the organization is still operating, it's important to introduce special leadership events. They supplement the regular downtime events provided to the player characters, and it's always a good idea to have a good mix of events because it doesn't have to always be positive, nor does it always have to be negative. And it basically falls into one of 3 categories: an opportunity, trouble, or a windfall. Let's go ahead and start with opportunity. So an opportunity arises, giving the player characters a chance to shape the future of their organization by making a decision, a fork in the road, a turning point. It is a decision for the organization. The consequences of these choices generally range from somewhat neutral outcomes to a combination of positive and or negative consequences. There's a good example from the book, and it talks about the Aspis Consortium proposes storing their goods in the player character's mercenary fort. Accepting the offer brings some financial benefits, but the player characters will have to deal with the consortium's questionable goods. Rejecting the proposal may upset the consortium, but allows the player characters to prioritize their conscience over financial gain. So it is a moral conundrum on whether they should accept this particular opportunity that was presented to them, but it's a realistic choice and gives life to the particular setting. Trouble is something goes wrong within the organization, requiring the player character's attention and assistance to resolve the issue. A good example here is the Thieves Guild is facing challenges from a clever new guard captain and needs the player character's help to stay safe. So typically the resources required from the player characters to resolve the trouble should be less than the benefits they gain to ensure that the organization provides a significant advantage rather than merely balancing things out. If it is just a balance, then there isn't a lot of incentive for the player characters to truly engage in these types of decisions and troubles. And then the last one they're talking about is a windfall. And basically, this is when the organization unexpectedly receives a benefit that directly assists the player characters. It often involves gaining access to some uncommon options, and this would be a good way to introduce those uncommon and even up to rare things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. Good example from the book. Again, very good for having examples in the book. And that is the organization might be researching a new spell, uncovering techniques for an uncommon feat, or acquiring additional funds or resources, maybe providing clues for the player character's adventures, or enhancing their political standing. You can also invite players to suggest options for their followers and lieutenants to work towards, offering creative ideas for these windfall events. So these windfall events might not just be random. They could be things that the player characters are actively working for. The only thing I would say for this one specifically is remember that your non-player characters in the organization aren't necessarily there to provide a material benefit without any cost whatsoever. They shouldn't be crafting individual items for the player characters, things along those sort. These should be larger goals. Now, I do hope this guide on the optional subsystem of leadership kind of helped you out and gave you some ideas. It is quite possibly one of the best ways to bring a little bit of reality, a little bit of depth to your particular setting, but it is a lot of work on the game master's part. I don't want to not mention that at all or kind of pushed aside. It would be a lot of work to do, but it can really just bring the world to life so much. But I do hope that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.